The Lady of Shadows. Chapter 1. Detta and Odetta. Stripped of jargon, what Adler said was this. The perfect schizophrenic, if there was such a person, would be a man or a woman not only unaware of his other persona, but unaware that anything was all amiss in his or her life. Adler should have met Detta Walker and Odetta Holmes. 1. "Last Gunslinger," Andrew said. He had been talking for quite a while, but Andrew always talked and Odetta usually just let it flow over her mind the way you let warm water flow over your hair and face in the shower. But this did more than catch her attention. It snagged it, as if on a thorn. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, I just come on the column in the paper," Andrew said. "I don't know who wrote it. I didn't notice. One of those political fellas, you know. Probably you'd know, Miss Holmes. I loved him, and I cried the night he was elected." She smiled, touched in spite of herself. Andrew said his ceaseless chatter was something he couldn't stop, wasn't responsible for, that it was just the Irish in him coming out, and most of it was nothing, chucklings and chirpings about relatives and friends she would never meet, half-baked political opinions, weird scientific commentary gleaned from any number of weird sources. Among other things, Andrew was a firm believer in flying saucers, which he called UFOs. But this touched her because she also cried the night he was elected. "But I didn't cry when that son of a bitch, pardon my French, Miss Holmes, when that son of a bitch Oswald shot him, and I hadn't cried since. It's been, 2 months? 3 months and 2 days, she thought. Something like that, I guess. Andrew nodded. Then I read this column in the Daily News. It might have been yesterday about Johnson's probably gonna do a pretty good job, but it won't be the same. The guy said America had seen the passage of the world's last gunslinger. I don't think John Kennedy was that at all, Odetta said, and if her voice was sharper than the one Andrew was accustomed to hearing, which it must have been because she saw his eyes give a startled blink in the rearview mirror, a blink that was more like a wince, it was because she felt herself touched by this too. It was absurd, but it was also fact. There was something about that phrase, America has seen the passage of the world's last gunslinger, that rang deep in her mind. It was ugly. It was untrue. John Kennedy had been a peacemaker, not a leather-slapping Billy the Kid type. That was more in the Goldwater line, but it had also for some reason given her goosebumps. Well, the guy said there would be no shortage of shooters in the world, Andrew went on, regarding her nervously in the rearview mirror. He mentioned Jack Ruby for one, and Castro, and this fellow in Haiti. Duvalier, she said. Papa Doc. Yeah, him. And the Dim brothers are dead. Well, he said Jack Kennedy was different, that's all. He said he would draw, but only if someone weaker needed him to draw, and if only there was nothing else to do. He said Kennedy was savvy enough to know that sometimes talking don't do any good. He said Kennedy knew if it was foaming at the mouth, you had to shoot it. His eyes continued to regard her apprehensively. Besides, it was just some column I read. The limo was gliding up Fifth Avenue now, headed towards Central Park, west, the Cadillac emblem on the end of the hood, cutting the frigid February air. Yes, Odetta said mildly, and Andrew's eyes relaxed a trifle. I understand. I don't agree, but I understand. You're a liar, a voice spoke up in her mind. This voice she heard quite often. She had never named it. It was the voice of the goad. You understand perfectly and agree completely. Lie to Andrew if you feel it necessary, but for God's sake, don't lie to yourself, woman. Yet part of her protested, horrified. In a world which had become a nuclear powder keg, upon which nearly 1 billion people now sat, it was a mistake, perhaps one of suicidal proportions, to believe there was a difference between good shooters and bad shooters. There were too many shaky hands holding the lighters near too many fuses. This was no world for gunslingers. If there had ever been a time for them, it had passed. Hadn't it? She closed her eyes briefly and rubbed her temples. She could feel one of her headaches coming on, something they threatened like an ominous build-up of thunderheads on a hot summer afternoon and then blew away, as those ugly summer brews sometimes simply slipped away in one direction or another to stomp their thunders and lightnings into the ground of some other place. She thought, however, that this time the storm was going to happen. It would come complete with thunder, lightning, and hail the size of golf balls. The streetlights marching up Fifth Avenue seemed much brighter. "So how is Oxford, Miss Holmes?" Andrew asked tentatively. "Humid. February or not, it was very humid." She paused, telling herself she wouldn't say the words that were crowding up in her throat like bile, that she would swallow them back down. To say them would be needlessly brutal. Andrew's talk of the world-class gunslinger had been just more of the man's endless prattling. But on top of everything else, it was just a bit too much, and it came out anyway. What she had no business saying. Her voice sounded as calm and as resolute as ever, she supposed. But she was not fooled. She knew a blurt when she heard one. The bail bondsman came very promptly, of course. He had been notified in advance. They held on to us as long as they could nevertheless, and I held on as long as I could, but I guess they won that because I ended up wetting myself. She saw Andrew's eyes wince away again, and she wanted to stop, and couldn't stop. It's what they want to teach you, you see, partially because it frightens you, I suppose, and a frightened person may not come down to their precious Southland and bother them again. But I think most of them, even the dumb ones, and they are by all means not all dumb, know that change will come in the end no matter what they do, and so they take the chance to degrade you while they still can. To teach you, you can be degraded. You can swear before God, Christ, and the whole company of saints that you will not soil yourself. But if they hold on to you long enough, of course you do. The lesson is that you're just an animal in a cage, no more than that, no better than that. Just an animal in a cage. So I wet myself. I can still smell dried urine and that damned holding cell. They think we are descended from the monkeys, you know. And that's exactly what I smell like to myself right now. A monkey? She saw Andrew's eyes in the rearview mirror and was sorry for the way his eyes looked. Sometimes your urine wasn't the only thing you couldn't hold. I'm sorry, Miss Holmes. No, she said, rubbing her temple again. I'm the one who's sorry. It's been a trying 3 days, Andrew. I should think so, he said in a shocked old maid's voice that made her laugh in spite of herself. But most of her wasn't laughing. She thought she had known what she was getting into, that she had fully anticipated how bad it could get. She had been wrong. A trying 3 days. Well, that was one way to put it. Another might be that her 3 days in Oxford, Mississippi, had been a short season in hell. But there were some things you couldn't say, some things you would die before saying, unless you were called upon to testify them before the throne of God the Father Almighty, where, she supposed, even the truths that caused the hellish thunderstorms in that strange grey jelly between your ears. The scientists say that grey jelly was nerveless, and if that wasn't a hoot, and half she didn't know what was, must be admitted. I just want to go home and bathe, and sleep. Then I reckon I'll be right as rain. Why sure, that's just what you're going to be. Andrew wanted to apologize for something, and this was so close as he could come. And beyond this, he didn't want to risk further conversation. So the two of them rolled in an unaccustomed silence to the grey Victorian block of apartments on the corner of 5th and Central Park South. A very exclusive grey Victorian block of apartments, and she supposed that made her a blockbuster, and she knew there were people in those poshy flats who would not speak to her unless they absolutely had to, and she didn't really care. Besides, she was above them now, and they knew she was above them. It had occurred to her on more than one occasion that it must have galled some of them mightily, knowing that there was a nigger living in the penthouse apartment of this fine staid old building, where once the only black hands allowed had been clad in white gloves, or perhaps the thin black leather ones of a chauffeur. She hoped it did gall them mightily, and scolded herself for being mean, for being unchristian, but she did wish it. She hadn't been able to stop the piss pouring into the crotch of her fine silk imported underwear, and she didn't seem to be able to stop this other flood of piss either. It was mean, it was unchristian, it was almost bad. No, worse. At least as far as the movement was concerned, it was counterproductive. They were going to win the rights they needed to win, and probably this year. Johnson, mindful of the legacy which had been left to him by the slain president, and perhaps hoping to put another nail in the coffin of Barry Goldwater, would do more than oversee the passage of Civil Rights Act. If necessary, he would ram it into law. So it was important to minimize the scarring and the hurt. There was more work to be done. Hate would not help do that work. Hate would, in fact, hinder it. But sometimes you went on hating just the same. Oxford Town had taught her that too. 2. Detta Walker had absolutely no interest in the movement and much more modest digs. She lived in the loft of a peeling Greenwich Village apartment building. Odetta didn't know about the loft and Detta didn't know about the penthouse, and the only one left who suspected something was not quite right was Andrew Feeney, the chauffeur. He had begun working for Odetta's father when Odetta was 14 and Detta Walker hardly existed at all. Sometimes Odetta disappeared. These disappearances might be a matter of hours or of days. Last summer, she had disappeared for 3 weeks, and Andrew had been ready to call the police when Odetta called him one evening and asked him to bring the car around at 10 the next day. She planned to do some shopping, she said. It trembled on his lips to cry out, "Miss Holmes, where have you been?" But he had asked this before and had received only puzzled stare. Truly puzzled stares, he was sure, in return. "Right here," she would say. "Why, right here, Andrew. You've been driving me 2 or 3 places every day, haven't you? You aren't starting to go a little mushy in the head, are you?" Then she would have laughed, and if she wasn't feeling especially good, as she often seemed to feel after her disappearances, she would pinch his cheek. "Very good, Miss Holmes," he said. "Then it is." That scary time she had been gone for 3 weeks, Andrew had put down the phone, closed his eyes, and said a quick prayer to the Blessed Virgin of Miss Holmes's safe return. Then had rung Howard, the doorman at her building. "What time did she come in?" "Just about 20 minutes ago," Howard said. "Who brought her?" "Dunno. You know how it is, different car every time. Sometimes they park around the block and I don't see him at all, don't even know she's back until I hear the buzzer and look out and see it's her." Howard paused, then added, "She's got one hell of a bruise on her right cheek." Howard had been right. It had been one hell of a bruise, and now it was getting better. Andrew didn't like to think what it might have looked like when it was fresh. Miss Holmes appeared promptly at 10 the next morning, wearing a silk sundress with spaghetti-thin straps. This had been late July, and by then the bruise had started to yellow. She had made only a perfunctory effort to cover it with makeup, as if knowing that too much effort to cover it would only draw further attention to it. "How did you get that, Miss Holmes?" he asked. She laughed merely. "You know me, Andrew, clumsy as ever. My hand slipped on the grab handle while I was getting out of the tub yesterday. I was in a hurry to catch the national news. I fell and banged the side of my face." She gouged his face. "You're getting ready to start blithering at me about the doctors and examinations, aren't you? Don't bother answering. After all these years I can read you like a book. I won't go, so you needn't bother asking. I'm just fine as paint. Onward, Andrew. I intend to buy half of Saks, all of Gimbel's, and eat everything at the Four Seasons in between." "Yes, Miss Holmes," he had said, and smiled. It was a forced smile, and forcing it was not easy. That bruise wasn't a day old. It was a week old, at least. And he knew better anyway, didn't he? He had called her every night at 7 o'clock for the last week, because if there was one time when you could catch Miss Holmes in her place, it was when the Huntley-Brinkley report came on. A regular junkie for her news was Miss Holmes. He had done it every night, that was, except last night. Then he had gone over and wheeled the passkey from Howard. A conviction had been growing on him subtly that she had just the sort of accident she had described, only instead of getting a bruise or a broken bone, she had died alone, and was lying up there dead right now. He had let himself in, heart thumping, feeling like a cat in a dark room crisscrossed with piano wires. Only there had been nothing to be nervous about. There was a butter dish on the kitchen counter, and although the butter had been covered, it had been out long enough to be growing a good crop of mold. He had got 3 at 10 minutes of 7, and had left 5 after. In the course of his quick examination of the apartment, he had glanced into the bathroom. The tub had been dry, the towels neatly, even austerely, arrayed, the room's many grab handles polished to a bright steel gleam that was unspotted with water. He knew the accident she had described had not happened. But Andrew did not believe she was lying either. She had believed what she had told him. He looked into the rearview mirror again and saw her rubbing her temple lightly with the tips of her fingers. He didn't like it. He had seen her do that too many times before on one of her disappearances. 3. Andrew left the motor running so she could have the benefit of the heater, then went around the trunk. He looked at her 2 suitcases with another wince. They looked as if petulant men with small minds and large bodies had kicked them relentlessly back and forth, damaging the bags in a way that did not quite dare damage Miss Holmes herself. The way they might have damaged him, for instance, if he had been there. It wasn't just that she was a woman. She was a nigger, an uppity northern nigger, messing where she had no business messing. And they probably figured a woman like that deserved just what she got. The thing was, she was also a rich nigger. Thing was, she was almost as well known to the American public as Medgar Evers or Martin Luther King. Thing was, she had gotten her rich nigger face on the cover of Time magazine, and it was a little harder to get away with sticking someone like that in the toolies and then saying, "What? No sir, boss, we sure didn't see anybody like that down here, did we, boys?" Thing was, it was a little harder to work yourself up to hurting a woman who was the only heir to the Holmes dental industries, when there were 12 Holmes plants in the sunny South, one of them just 1 county over from Oxford Town. So, they'd done to her suitcase what they didn't dare do to her. He looked at these mute indications of her stay in Oxford Town with the shame and fury and love, emotions as mute as the scars on the luggage that had gone away looking smart and had come back looking dumb and tramped. He looked temporarily unable to move, and his breath puffled out on the frosty air. Howard was coming out to help, but Andrew paused a moment longer before grasping the handles of the cases. "Who are you, Miss Holmes? Who are you really? Where do you go sometimes, and what do you do that seems so bad that you have to make up a false history of the missing hours or days, even to yourself?" And he thought something else in the moment before Howard arrived. Something weirdly apt. "Where's the rest of you? You want to quit thinking like that. If anyone around here was going to do anything like that, it would be Miss Holmes, but she doesn't, and so you don't either." Andrew lifted the bags out of the trunk and handed them to Howard, who asked in a low voice, "Is she all right?" "I think so," Andrew replied, also pitching his voice low. "Just tired, that's all. Tired all the way down to her roots." Howard nodded, took the battered suitcases, and started back inside. He paused only long enough to tip his cap to Odetta Holmes, who was almost invisible behind the smoked glass window, in a soft and respectful salute. When he was gone, Andrew took out some collapsed stainless steel scaffolding at the bottom of the trunk and began to unfold it. It was a wheelchair. Since August 19th, 1959, some 5.5 years before, the part of Odetta Holmes from the knees down has been as missing as those blank hours and days. Thank you everybody for sitting down with another part of Majin reading the drawing of the 3. I'm sorry it's been 3 weeks and no production. Basically, vacation, our Easter, me being lazy. That's it. So here we are, hopefully again, daily production starting. Thank you for listening. See you all tomorrow. Long days and pleasant nights.